Kingsley.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. And thank you so much for this very generous and valuable invitation from the university. And special thanks, of course, to Luca for his excellent organisation of the event. So, the subject that I want to talk about today is exile. One specific case of it is an institution of esoteric tantric Buddhism called Koyasan in Japan in the 13th century, and its textualization in the transcript of an oracular spirit possession. But more broadly, I'm interested in what happens to knowledge, which is embodied when a body is cast out. And conversely, what does it mean for knowledge or for spirits to be disembodied? What happens in spirit possession? These two topics concern us today: exile and spirit possession, and the relationship between them. Before entering into the main topic, I want to draw back for a moment because my study of medieval Buddhism is part of a trilogy in progress, the center and linking factor of which is the essential question of the understanding of the body and its relation to spirit, self, and other, and the metaphors by which people and societies live that are dictated by that conceived relationship. On this theme, my projects are intimately connected, and they're all on mountain religions in Japan, although they seem quite disparate. More personally, this summer I joined a volunteer group to gather tsunami debris on a northern Japanese beach. This tsunami debris is swept up every time there's a storm. It comes up with the tides. Uniforms, shoes, bags, bank cards, anything with a name on it was to be returned to relatives, sometimes bones. Why is it so important to bring back the body of the material things closest to it? This is something that we all intuitively and empathetically and perhaps experientially understand. In ancient East Asia, the death rituals concerned with such reintegration have a considerable anthropological literature and historical literature. But I want to mention here just one, the famous soul summoning ritual in the Chinese Yili, or the handbook of etiquette for gentlemen, which involves a shamanistic priest standing on a roof wearing the robes of the dead and trying to summon back the spirit. Such rituals like these were adopted in Japan as well, and they are concerned with revival of a dead body, but they point out the importance of capturing an escaping soul or a spirit that wanders from the body in death. If a body is lost to sea or to war, for example, or somehow far from home in exile, its spirit can forever wander. The ancient Chinese poetry anthology, the Chu Si, or the Songs of the South, combines the fates of exiles with themes of shamanistic soul summoning. With esoteric Buddhism in Japan in particular, the proper death and burial was vital and mixed with these ideas. But in Buddhism, it was for the purpose of a good rebirth. So this is an example closer to us in time. And this is actually the third part of my trilogy. This is in the early 20th century. A Scottish aristocrat who you can see standing at the side of this enormous monument, Elizabeth Anna Gordon, went to Koyasan, the mountain I will be discussing today, one of the first women to be allowed to go there. And she erected this monument and she wrote copious books about religion. But she also has half of her remains buried at Koyasan next to this monument. This is not a gravestone, it's a stele from China, or a replica of it. And she had the other part left in Korea. These were what she considered her spiritual homelands, even though she was from Scotland. But she was also following a very long tradition of burial an enormous cemetery site at Koyasan, which is called Okunoen, and it's near to the mausoleum of the founder of Koyasan. He's believed to be in eternal meditation inside a cave. And like the 13th century monks at Koyasan, that we will be discussing presently, she believed that the founder Kukai, in his eternal meditation, would emerge at some point in the future with the future Buddha Maitreya to usher in a new enlightened world, and that she would be reborn within it. Let's look at the converse. This is my second part. These are corpses cast out and not given proper treatment. This is a genre of painting called kusozu, which many of you have probably heard about. It's a 13th century painting, contemporary with the texts we'll be talking about today. And these paintings were used supposedly as surrogates for staring at corpses. They're the 9 stages of disintegration of a corpse, and they were used supposedly for meditation on impermanence, for the cultivation of the Buddhist mind. But in fact, they evolved very quickly into gendered othering and abjectness and spectacle. And my own project traces this into the post-war period and into the present day, where they became caught up in the aesthetic of the grotesque, which became very popular in Japan. So these are bodies that are not porous in their boundaries in order to be possessed by spirits, but to break and to fuse in strange ways with other elements, which is the quintessence of the grotesque aesthetic. They were often cast out or depicted in real charnelgrams, and these were at the bases of mountains. So they were set off against the religious sacred area of the mountain. And actually the base of a mountain in Japan was connected not only with death and defilement and grotesqueness, but with sex and prostitution as well from quite early on. So the third and main topic today is another type of body. And this is the body that's cast out in exile, and the body that holds knowledge in the form of a possessed and knowledgeable spirit, and in the form of Buddhist teachings, passed usually orally from master to student in an esoteric Buddhist lineage. In our subject and text today, the 2 bodies are essentially the same in nature. So let me give you a brief summary of it. Just to give you a very broad idea, in case you don't know, this is the site of Shingon Buddhism in Japan, or one of the headquarters is Koyasan, and that's Koyasan presently today, and the founder who imported this kind of Buddhism in the 9th century. He was posthumously titled, as you can see, Kobo Daishi. That will become relevant later. So the text I want to talk about today, that concerns spirit possession in exile, was apparently written in 1251. We don't know for certain because the original has been lost, but internal evidence points to 1251. The record of the oracle of Daishi Myojin at Hennyo-in Cloister. And this is a record of information delivered during oracular spirit possession at Koyasan, and related to a highly ranking scholar monk of the time, Dohan, and to his branch, the Chuan-ryu. At this time in Japanese history and in the history of esoteric Buddhism, the 13th century, there was a proliferation of sects. I mean, they were kind of out of control, and there were so many branches and sub-branches and sub-sub-branches with very small differences in detail, different mudras, different mantras, slightly different rituals. It was connected to patronage and all of that sort of thing. But the Chuan-ryu at Koyasan were very powerful, and they were trying hard to establish themselves as the mainstream. The Chuan-ryu literally translates to the central cloister branch. This oracle was channeled through a child, a chigo. A chigo is an acolyte monk, a teenage boy who would live at the temples at Koyasan and other monastic institutions. He was spontaneously possessed, and he continued to be possessed for about 12 days, continually delivering messages which were recorded by Dohan. And this is the contents. So just to give it in brief, to give you an idea of what the text contains, the first part is devoted to administrative matters, and the very first part at the top, on the disturbance between the two temples, is the one that concerns the exiles, the background of which I will explain in a moment. And then from number 4 onwards, you can see that it's separated into 9 sections. Sorry, the bottom part has disappeared. These are all secret teachings about Koya-san. They're extremely esoteric. Things like descriptions of rocks, secret esoteric meaning of a rock, or when you should enter a hall and when you shouldn't because of the presence of sacred beings, things you should be afraid of, secret identities for different divinities, this kind of thing. As for the institution at which the oracle occurred, the spirit possession occurred, Henmyoen was originally located right next to the founder's original temple, supposedly where he lived. So it was a very important place. But it moved several times, and after the possession had occurred, a special altar was built at the temple so that Daishi Myojin, this strange possessing spirit, could be invoked every single day and worshipped every single day. But finally the temple burned down, and apparently all that was left, at least in the 19th century, was one charred bit of wood that I suppose it could still survive, but it must have been very well treasured for it to have been recorded. Somewhere it survives, but the institution itself has disappeared. And these are the very opening lines of the text. This is what happened. On the 12th day of the 11th month of Kencho 3, which is 1251, a strange thing happened to the long-haired acolyte Jishio, who was long-haired because he hadn't been tonsured as a monk, of Henmyoen. And from the 13th day of the same month, calling himself the medium of the former great past master of the same cloister, and channeling a god named Daishi Daimyojin, delivered an oracle. If you can read Japanese, sorry, this is an old map that shows the location. Henmyoen is up here. I did have a pointer that I showed right here. And this is the Kukai's original residence. Okay. So, finally, what was the nature of this god that had possessed the child? The name of the god is Daishi Myojin, and it was a very strange new god who appears for the first time explained within this oracle. It explained its own nature. I found references to it in older texts, but it seems very mysterious, and at some point it was completely forgotten. It's now unheard of at Koya-san. But it was an amalgamation of... We'll go to the exegetical part first to explain it. Daishi Myojin. Daishi Dai is Keika. Keika was the teacher of the founder Kukai, his Chinese teacher from whom he received the esoteric teachings. Shi is Daishi, so that's Kobo Daishi, the other name for Kukai. So we've got two patriarchs, or two spirits of the patriarchs. Myo is new, Kami is Koya. New and Koya refer to the mountain gods. I just skipped over the slides there, but we have two very beautiful paintings, also from around the same period as this text, probably 13th or 14th century. The goddess of Cinnabar and Mercury, and the god of hunting. And because the Buddhist sect made its temples on a mountain, it incorporated the mountain gods. And these two gods were identified as the two parts of the esoteric Buddhist mandala, the Ryobukai. So That's the womb world mandala and the diamond world mandala. There is always this analogy system in Japanese Shingon Buddhism where one thing stands for another, and finally everything is a manifestation of the cosmic Buddha. And these are the two mandalas. And then these are the patriarchs, or some of them. So in the center, that's Keika, and then Kukai. So according to this, the 4 characters Daishi Myojin comprise a secret mandala. In one's daily life, one should put it in one's mind and chant it when one has fear in the evil world, and when one last closes one's eyes, which is a euphemism for death, one should chant this name mantra. So it's a god, and it's also a mantra. So you can see the place where the possession happened, Henmyoin, is gone completely. The god, Daishi Myojin, is extinct. No one's heard of him. He disappeared probably around the 15th century, 15th or 16th century. And the text itself does not survive. The original text has never been found. It's been reconstructed from copies, the earliest of which is 14th century, and in segments as well. So the entire project is extremely elusive. But let's now talk about the why of the text and its historical context. And it's here that the god, or the kami, and the figures, the monastic figures connected with this text, become clearer. As you may recall from the list of contents, the first section deals with the disturbance between the 2 temples. These 2 temples were both at Koyasan, Kongo-Buji and Daiden-Boen, and they had been locked in conflict for about 2 centuries. Daiden-Boen had fantastic patronage from members of the imperial family. It had estates given to it. It was favoured by one of the great emperors. It had a lot of money. It was producing a lot of texts. It had a very powerful founder called Kakuban, who was introducing new practices that were not really traditional to Kukai's teachings. And it was a major threat to Kongo-Buji, which was much older. And it also had managed to take over some of the estates that were owned by Kongo-Buji. So they were having a fight for quite a long time. They did not like each other at all, and they would do terrible things to each other. One incident was the robe ripping incident, which was when Kongo-Buji monks burst into a scholarly ceremony of the Daiden-Boen monks and ripped their robes off them and ripped them up because they were not considered the conservative traditional robes. And they both complained about each other a lot. But it's not just, I don't think it was just to do with money and power, it was also to do with scholarship, because at Koyasan, having good scholars holding great debate assemblies on the doctrines was a sign of prestige. It attracted more patronage. I mean, these things were linked together, but they were both very, very proud of their scholarship and their teaching. The culmination of this was what had happened here in 1242, and it was an arson attack by Kongo-Buji on Daiden-Boen's temples and residential halls. All of the Daiden-Boen monks were forced out of the mountain at that time, and all the best scholar monks of Kongo-Buji were sent away. I have, for a long time, been puzzled by the disjunct between the opening section of this text, the Takisenki, and then the 9 parts afterwards, which are largely on shamanic practices of possession, soul retrieval, these secret teachings, magical foxes, mysterious snakes, and so on. But you may be able to foretell my resolution of this. Exile or spirit loss or retrieval were already connected in a very old narrative and in an older reality, such as the poem cycles I earlier mentioned. As we examine the accounts of the violence and arson attack, from now on, you may find yourself seeing it as a cynical justification through sacralization of plain crime and violence. But I want to argue against this. The Congo-Buji monks who wrote this, they were terrified of losing their knowledge of esoteric Buddhism, which they thought had come directly from Kukai and through an unbroken lineage transmission, which was also oral and was also secret. Some of it was written down, but a lot of it was oral, or they would write teachings on kirigami, which are just little strips of paper with short teachings and messages on them. And they would lose this through rivalry and rival knowledge represented by Daidenboen monks, and also by losing their greatest scholar monks to exile. And in fact, 2 monks had already died by the time the Takusenki was written. Both teaching and spirits would be left to wander and dissipate. And so I see this section as a representation of desperation to retain embodied truths, and it's no coincidence that the monks concerned with its production and those exiled were what we can call them shamans. They practiced mountain religions, mountain ascetic practices. And of course, as the text itself being a product of an oracular possession, they understood spirit possession and soul summoning and soul retrieval. It's also no coincidence that the text occurs in tandem with an uptick in the production of textualized teachings. And these are called shogyo, which literally means sacred texts. They're non-canonical Buddhist texts, new texts, sometimes found. They would be discovered in strange places and attributed to Kukai or some other past master. But they came from different sources than the canon. And they were kept within lineages, so they were building their own libraries. But this increased so much in the 13th century that it's later been called shogyo shigi, which means something like sacred works ism. And they were proliferating, of course, with the lineages, because the lineages all wanted to have their own shogyo. And this Takusenki was also considered a shogyo, too. So there's this move from embodied knowledge, which is oral, into locking it down into texts. So I want to read some of this section now and point up the treatment of violence and exile in esoteric Shingon Buddhism. So at the very beginning, they describe these disputes and they say, we decided to punish the evil hearts of the Denboen monks. They don't call them Dai Denboen because Dai means great, and this is a biased account. Denboen went up in flames. This was the punishment. The scholar monks of Kongo-Buji settled through council that this was the will of the gods. It was said at the meeting that the bows and arrows of Aizen Myo, which is a very powerful divinity worshipped in Shingon Buddhism, were borrowed. It was said that a punishment should be dealt to the bad monks of Denboen. The fire, which was actually arson, right, was an Aizen or Goma, a fire ritual. It was not a human act. The original vow, this is a little unclear, so it's my translation, but the original vow of Aizen had been violated, so the hearth was pulled out. Thus, the Shuto, or the scholar monks of this temple, only added altar wood to the Aizen or Goma. It should be thought of as the flames of Aizen Myo's samadhi, his meditative state. So this is all being recast. They're talking about the major ritual in Shingon Buddhism, which is the Gomagyo, fire ritual, recasting arson as a sacred act and saying we just added some wood to the fire. It's not human. And they say that they settled through council that this was the will of the gods. This was also fairly conventional. At other large, powerful Buddhist institutions of the time had similar meetings where they would settle their decisions by consulting the gods in some way. Aizen Myo features large in the Takusenki, and especially in the opening passage, as well as his magical arrows, his bows and arrows, and his fire. So they say, as I say, they say that the flames are the kasho sanmai. These are the This is the heat that's emitted from the body in a state of deep meditation, deep meditative focus. But this fire also burns demonic influences on the outside, and it was used in a special rite for dispelling enemies and baleful forces. But Aizen was especially connected to this enemy dispelling in the 13th century because his bows and arrows were symbolically used by the monk Eison to ritually dispel the invasions of the troops of the Yuan dynasty. He tried to invade Japan twice. In fact, the bow and arrow were conceptually linked to the divine wind that created a typhoon to drive away the invaders, the origin of the term kamikaze, or divine wind, better known today from more recent wars. But here, the enemies are those of Kongo-Buji and of Kukai's original teachings, as they saw them threatened by Daidenboen's newfangled theories. And in the same period, a new form of Aizen appeared, merged with the usually more central Fudomyo. They go together in this period. This is completely non-canonical. You can't find this in any canonical Buddhist texts. It was a Japanese invention. They joined Fudo and Aizen together with two heads to make this doubly powerful divinity. And then later on in the... Oh, also please note down here, the two, they're called doji, they're kind of spirit children, magical children, and chigo, these children in temples who were prone to possession, are related to these magical children. Children and women, of course, because in another sense they had porous boundaries or were somehow more innocent or cut off from society or particularly prone to possession. Yeah. So you can see a closer detail there. This painting actually is called a two-headed Aizen, but it's clear that it's Fudo on one side. He has a very distinctive braid hanging down. This is from Koya-san, from the same period. This is also from Koya-san, from a shrine which protects Koya-san nearby. So later on in the Taikasenki, a very, very unusual form of the two is described, standing statues of Aizen and of Fudo. These were immensely rare. They're very, very rare today. And even at the time, they're remarked upon in the Taikasenki as very rare and requiring explanation. And Daishi Myojin, the god, explains why. And the reason why there are standing Aizen myos is so that they would be ready to race out from wherever they had been enshrined and defend the realm against enemies. So again, it's 13th century, you really see this increase in the use of these gods for fighting against enemies. But in this case, it's enemies of the religion on their own side, which is quite unusual. The standing Aizen, pictured here, which is also on the poster, this is an Edo period statue. But I think it very well may be a later copy of the one which is mentioned in the Taikasenki, because they are so rare and because it's been traced back to Koya-san. And this is just has nothing to do with the talk subject at all, but here, this is a 3D reprinting or 3D printing of the same icon, because there's been an increase of theft of Buddhist icons in Japan, and the head curator of the museum close to Koya-san, the Prefectural Museum of Wakayama, is heading a project to make 3D prints of icons and remove the originals to museums and use the 3D prints in the temples. And this was one of his first projects. Now to consider the exiles themselves. It was the arrangement of Daishi Myojin that the Achari, Dohan, was sent down to Sanuki, because it is the birthplace of Daishi. So Dohan, he's the one that wrote down this oracle text, and one of the most prolific and scholarly monks of the time. He was sent to Sanuki, which is today's I've forgotten the name. It's where Kukai, the founder, referred to as Daishi, was born. And he was actually sent down to the temple where the founder had been born. So it was kind of a nice exile. It wasn't really like a punishment. Because the temple monks were exiled, the Buddhist law was spread throughout all regions, as was talent. And this was an expedient means for salvation through teaching. And so again, they're making the best of the situation. This is actually an expedient means. And okay, they say maybe he was sent down to this place to revive Zensuji, which is this temple that had belonged to Kukai, or that was at the place of his birthplace. Although there have been many people exiled, both in the past and nowadays, it's never before happened that the place of exile is enjoyed. This is absolutely because of the protection of the Myojin. I'm sorry, there's so much terminology here, which maybe not everybody is familiar with. Myojin is another word for the mountain gods, or maybe for Daishi Myojin, this other god. So they didn't really get sent to bad places, actually. They seem to have been sent to quite comfortable places. However, it says, this is a criticism of their rivals, right? They're saying if one is separated from the temple because of karma, the Shingon writings and such must be returned to the mountain, and you should stop practicing Shingon. So they're talking to the Daidenboin monks here. And the criticism continues on. If one should separate from the Shingon school and turn to the Nenbutsu school, which were these new theories that Daidenboin were embracing, one should not criticize Shingon. There will be punishments in this and the next world. Here again, they're kind of repainting the exiles in a beneficial light, but they also start to talk about how the teachings are threatened through exile. They say, even if it's said that exile had not been necessary, if this as a warning had not been issued, calamities across our land would occur and would not cease. Therefore, even though the exile took place, it was according to the rules of society and arranged by Daishi Myojin, and so on and so forth. So it's somehow making the best of things. At the time of the exiles, warriors dispatched by the Bakufu, the warrior government, were sent to Koyasan to be on guard because things were still very, very volatile. And they say this is really great because it means that these warriors are creating a special connection with Koyasan, and this is an expedient means. This is a way of exposing people to Buddhism. So again, they're putting it in a good light. This part's quite shocking. If the monks of Denboen had won, Daishi's Buddhist law would have become extinct. That is to say, the whole mountain was in danger. Everyone should be fearful in every part of their bodies. And then they say the Denboen monks, though they had this incident on the mountain, they were actually suffering from delusional attachments. And then it's a little unclear, actually, the translation of this has been quite a challenge. But they say, we do forgive you, but you should kill yourselves anyway, because it's so evil. So I don't know about you, but when I first read this section, I felt it was I felt very cynical about it. They're simply recasting things to their own benefits, justifying what they did, and saying things that don't sound very Buddhist to me. They even say at the very end of the section, if this happens again, then we'll do the same thing again and burn down your temples. And that's the end of the discussion of this violent incident and of the exile. Okay. So although this does seem disturbingly like a justification, it's very clear that there's a very palpable worry about losing the teachings. The text may have been intended to justify and to reconsolidate a community in turmoil, for sure, but it also indicates fear. And a letter that I discovered from 1247 supports this. It's quite similar in language, and this is not very surprising because it was dispatched by a group of scholars who were closest to Dohan, one of the exiles and the writer of the Takasenki, in order to petition for the return of the exiles. In fact, two of the writers were part of his immediate cohort. They had the same teacher as him. And another one who signed this letter or wrote this letter was himself the teacher of one of the witnesses to the oracular possession at Henmyoen and a signatory of the transcript. His name was Yushin, and I will return to him as a significant character in this story. And the letter contains the following passage. If the exiles do not return to the clouds of this mountain, in other words, the temple, they will become homesick spirits. If the exiles are left there and do not return and live here and become dust in peripheral regions means places that do not have any connection with Buddhism. It's a term that was used in connection with the idea of mappo, which is the end of Dharma, the extinction of Dharma, the idea that the Dharma is completely lost. It's a conventional expression. And they say, who will transmit Daishi's teachings? And who will gift the teacher's explanations? How can the oral transmissions be told? They cannot. The teachings are something a person has, and the teachings protect the realm. If there is no one who holds the teachings, there is no protector of the realm. They're writing to the government, right? So they're emphasizing the connection of Buddhist teachings to the protection of Japan. So for the sake of the teachings and the sake of the realm, can't you do something to forgive the exiles? This passage from the letter indirectly cites Bai Juyi's poem, which I have an extract of here. This is just a very, very small extract. It's from a famous poem you may have heard of. My body would have died and my soul hovered by the bones that no one gathered. A ghost I'd have wandered in Yunnan, always looking for home. It indirectly cites this in two ways, in the term the homesick spirit, Bokyo-no-ki, and the character for cloud, which is, of course here it's one of two characters making up Yunnan province, but it means mountain temple in the Japanese context. Bai Juyi himself was an exile, but most importantly, this citation would have brought to its readers' minds an arousal of sympathy for the Buddhist state of Muen. Muen literally means disconnected or unconnected, but specifically it refers to the spirits of the uncared-for dead, lamenting those who die in foreign lands because their bones could not be returned and they'd become spirits homesick for their homeland, which was Koyasan. Well, let's remember again the importance and popularity of Koyasan at the time, all over Japan, in fact. It was a place where bones could be buried near to the founder and in anticipation of Maitreya's arrival. And this was all over Japan. They would go around, send people around to collect bones to take back to Koyasan and bury for this purpose. So these exiles, all brilliant scholars, had already some of these exiles had already died in their places of banishment. Surely the emphasis in the Takasenki on the importance of maintaining control of the teachings and transmission, and on teachings as functioning to protect the worldly realm, a well-established ideology, is related to this notion of the wandering spirit. This does not lack precedent. And Bai Juyi's poem itself is referring back to an older tradition as well. There is a poem in the Chu Se called Zhao Hun, or The Summoning of the Soul. This was in an early edition of the anthology, the 2nd century BC. The editor, Wang Yi, states that Song Yu had written this poem to restore the soul of Qu Yan, who was an exile at the time. And he also says that it was written as an entreatment to the king to bring this exile back. this idea, this interpretation of the soul summoning poem is not accepted by contemporary, like present-day scholars. But Japanese scholarly monks, who were essentially the literati of the day in the 13th century, may very well have made the Exile interpretation, or accepted that interpretation. Now, another figure's commentaries, the earliest we have on the text Senki, supports this, and those are the commentaries of Yukai. Have you anybody heard of Yukai? Okay. So Yukai has been very badly painted in history. He is best known as a very ruthless cleanser of Koya-san's Buddhism, wiping out heretical teachings as he interpreted them. By his period, so starting in the 13th century or a little earlier, as I mentioned, the lineages were proliferating. It was completely crazy. They just, if you tried to map them all out, you just have a nightmare. Sub branches. So many different teachings. And by his time, there were so many competing lineages that he felt the need to purge the tradition, and he even burnt a lot of works. There's a piece of land at Koya-san that even today monks don't walk over because it's believed to be where all the texts were burned, and there's something impure about a place where heretical texts were burned, so they walk around that part of the site. But Yukai tells us something more about why the Chigo was possessed and why the oracle text as a whole was necessary. He himself records an experience with a possessed child, a girl, in fact, which is very unusual because women were not allowed at Koya-san until really the late 19th century. Anyway, a possessed girl who claimed Buddhist knowledge. She was 11 years old. And he tests this child on a difficult doctrinal point before accepting help from her. We can see from this that these kinds of possessions of children were being taken as a form of transmission, as long as they were reliable, of Buddhist transmission. Yukai explains that one of the witnesses at Koya-san was the head of Henmyoen, where it took place, but that he was not qualified to be the head of Henmyoen because he'd somehow missed receiving an important teaching from his master. And this was the monk Yushin. Yushin, who had also was one of the writers of this letter to the government, citing Baiju Yi and asking for the return of the exiles. Apart from the opening section, the rest of the text Senki is all the secret teachings of the mountain, and these were conveyed to Yushin via the child, the possessed child, but ultimately through the child, from the greatest source of all knowledge at Koya-san, Daishi Myojin, right? This combination of the two patriarchs and the two mountain kami. This is a very early, there's very little evidence of Daishi Myojin, as I said. There's no iconography. Again, this is from the 13th century. It says Namu Daishi Myojin, something like praise Daishi Myojin. That was found relatively recently, these woven images. So we find a little bit there. But we find it with Yukai. This is a text by Yukai, which starts off again with an invocation of Daishi Myojin. So Yukai is the earliest to talk about the text Senki, and he's asked about it by his student. He's asked to explain what happened and why it happened. And he explains, as I've mentioned, there was a head of this temple. The lineage was going to be severed, and so at that time, Yogo Myojin, another name for Daishi Myojin, delivered an oracle in the west room of the cloister via the Chigo. It was witnessed and it was stored in an Injin box. This is a box where you keep your teachings. And I won't read the whole thing out, but he gives a line of monks in a certain lineage, and then gets to Yushin and says it was about to be severed here. He also says, it was said that there was no resident caretaker at this temple, at the answer that the caretaker was Yushin, it was said by the gods that one should be called a juji or a caretaker or like the kind of like the head of the temple or the cloister, as a result of having received the branch transmissions, and this was not so. Accordingly, Yushin received these and called them the oracle teachings. And again, in yet another text, Yukai had quite a lot to say about this, and it was because he was interested in lineage and figuring out what was legitimate and what wasn't. And he says, the Myojin, Daishi Myojin, says through the Chigo, even if there is a building, there are no monks, which is a very strange thing to say. There are no monks in this building. He's talking about Henmyoin. The elders who were in the group there, the ones watching the oracular possession, asked what it meant, that there were no monks. The Myojin replied, saying, there is no one who can transmit the teachings of the sect. And then finally, in the Takusenki itself, the very same reasoning appears. Although there are halls and monks' lodgings at this temple, as long as this teaching is not transmitted, it is as if it has no spirit. And so this text, which initially seems a very elusive puzzle to me, and was described as psychedelically influenced by a monk I consulted on it, because he found it so very strange and difficult to understand, it seems to me that it really is all about the loss of knowledge, of unwritten, orally transmitted knowledge. We think of Buddhist knowledge and of Buddhist education and scholarship as very sort of head-based and intellectual, and somehow divorced from the practice of spirit possession. Yet, until the concentrated effort to commit the teachings to compendiums or to collect together disparate kirigami, these little strips of paper, they were just collected together and put into books that were then treasured by the lineages. Much was purely oral and easily lost when the people who owned them in this way became themselves lost. For the Koyasan monks of the 13th century, the spirits of ancient Chinese exiles were the equivalents of the secret teaching possessed by their Buddhist monks in exile, left to wander, to corrupt and be corrupted, to confuse. Lineages brought back into line by figures like Yukai, and via special powers of possession for Yushin, were buttressed. As the oral teachings came to be carefully collected and copied, the teachings were buttressed as these teachings became collected and copied. A textual culture in Japanese esoteric Buddhism became well established, and the vulnerable and banishable body became the book. Today, the Chuin Ryu, who won in this horrible conflict, headed by Dohan, it's the mainstream today. And the stability of the monastic institution was very well evidenced in a remark made by a priest to me when I asked him if there were any oracles today, any takusen. And he said, yes, of course. I was really surprised because I couldn't imagine that there could be possessions and oracles. So I prompted him to explain, and he said, yes, but not with gods, because now we have priestly council meetings. But for him, an oracle just simply meant a rule and teaching. They no longer use gods, but they still use the same kind of language to talk about transmission of teachings and to lay down rules and to sort out their conflicts. So, thank you.